And my suggestion to the subcommittee, I'm willing to be overruled, is just to ask the district council to do that, and have language both for the regional agreement and for the motion at the that we would send to the towns. Does anybody greatly desire to wordsmith that, or you have to send it to them eventually anyway? I see and hear no enthusiasm for taking that away from district council.
Especially given the lack of clarity from the language in the old agreement.
Great. Paul's a little bit hard to hear from me, but what I heard him say was that given how there was lack of clarity in previous language, it's probably good to start with council on that, and I think that's fine. So I'll ask him to do that, and hopefully that'll be relatively inexpensive. Where I think we need to spend our time tonight, though, is figuring out how we're going to proceed with the feedback that we got, and what we want to do for the size of the committee proposal. I don't know if I just heard what I wanted to hear, but there was some variety of opinion. What was people's take home from what they heard from the committee? Linda?
So what I heard from the committee was mostly interest in the weighted voting, but I did hear a surprising amount of support for just the expansion to 26, which I was not expecting any support on that. So I thought it was notable that there was some. So that was my takeaway, was that there was more question of how to proceed than I expected to hear.
Ken, if I can go, I can't see anyone.
Sure, go ahead, Matt.
Anybody else? I heard the same thing that Linda heard, and it kind of fell on two sides of the spectrum. One is, I think everybody agreed that doing nothing, it seemed, didn't have any proponents for that. And then it was, okay, if we're going to correct what we have, it looks like there's one option, which is a larger committee, which is probably the correcting what we have, doing the least amount of changes. And then it seemed that the reduction of the size, it seemed that the majority weighted towards the weighted voting. So I left there kind of saying, all right, if we're going to deliberate this and come back to the committee, I think having 5 options is probably not the best idea. Having 1 is probably the best, but having 2 is probably what I heard, and I think that that's probably reasonable to look at, perhaps as giving the committee 2 options that model something around what those 2 discussions were.
Yeah, I kind of heard the same, and my suggestion was going to be something along the lines of what Matt was suggesting, but I yield to the committee on that, was that I was thinking of asking, I think there's some little details we have to work out with the weighted voting, which we can talk about tonight, about when the weights get redone. But I was going to propose that we ask district council to come up with a language for weighted voting and language for the expansion of the committee, both of which would get rid of a lot of our existing language. I think putting up as the first option the weighted vote, but if it was to be not the will of the committee to vote for that, once we took a vote, to have the language for the other model ready to go, so that we could then say, okay, well, if this presented, though, here's a motion. If this fails, from what we heard you all saying, if this fails, here's a secondary motion, or not secondary motion, doesn't really work. Here's a different motion that we could go move on at that meeting, because I think it's actually pretty timely that we not wait for it to fail, come back, have another motion. I think it would be pretty straightforward for him to write both options. If we get a little bit of clarity around what weighted voting will look like tonight. I mean, would people mind that, Paul?
First off, can you hear me better now?
Yes, you are a little louder now.
All right, I'll keep that. I think I know what's going on. do we even have to change the language? Because wasn't it scheduled to go up for 2 people in Rutland anyway due to regular population changes?
I mean, what I heard was that it wasn't actually the right distribution if we let that happen,
Okay.
and that, and it's not guaranteed to happen anyway, with Rutland's population versus Princeton. So I thought the idea was that we would just change it, make it simpler, and have it be the right, quote unquote, right numbers. Is that what people heard, or?
I can say yes. I do remember
Okay.
that now. Yes, that makes sense.
If we wanted to write a proposal with weighted voting, one thing that was not clear to me from the meeting, and perhaps we can just make a recommendation, is what language we would want around weighting. So would we want the weighting to be, say, reevaluated after each annual town election, or would we want the weighting to stay the same over the 5-year period? Because it wouldn't change the number of people on the committee, but you could imagine saying, at annual town elections, the committee will reweight and blah, 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 based on the previous town census. Or is that just too confusing? Linda?
I mean, based on the other conversations that have come up with feedback on the current regional, I think that that should be laid out now if we can, but I don't believe that that was part of the discussion with the full committee. I think that the full committee discussion so far had just been weighted or expansion or other options, but not the nitty gritty. I would probably tend towards the 5 years just because that's a lot of, it seems like there would be a lot of wiggle room within the weights as it's been suggested and as it's been presented to the committee so far. That adjustment probably wouldn't really come to much every year, but it could every 5.
What others think about that?
I would tend to think doing it yearly is probably a little probably not achievable, and probably wouldn't happen unless there was somebody who was designated to do that. I tend to think every 5 years. If people had a desire to do it sooner than every 5, I would think maybe something like every 3 years, which tends to be the majority of the terms people are elected for. But I would almost put it in alignment with the review of the regional agreement, so it coincides with it.
That surely is more straightforward. Carl?
I mean, the only thing I could foresee, like, having some kind of pushback on that would be, like, if for whatever reason, like, one of the towns just had a large jump in their census. And so, I mean, I don't know, like, you could say, like, unless, like, a town census increases by, I wouldn't know, like, a good percentage, but, like unless the town's census increases by, like, 2% over a year, then you wouldn't reevaluate. And that would just be something that would capture, like, if for whatever reason someone's town jumped up really big in that after the first year, and they wouldn't be theoretically underrepresented with their weighting for the remainder of the term.
Hey Ken, can I follow up to that point? Because I was thinking a similar thing. But if we were to say every 5 years, could it still be up to the will of the school committee to evaluate that in those 5 years if something like that happens?
I mean, the school committee can always reopen their regional agreement if they want to, right? If they think something crazy has happened, like, like everybody moved out of Princeton, or Holden built 800,000 new houses on Main Street, the latter of which more likely to happen, some 10-story high rise. Yeah.
So would that give us some of the flexibility in that regard? I'm just wondering if we need to think of every scenario, or if we have the flexibility within the parameters to modify within whatever time frame we mention.
I mean, I personally think we have that flexibility and it won't be used, which I think is both okay, right? Like I don't think future committees are going to jump to review the regional agreement before they have to, unless there's something that's just like, pressing them down with unfairness. And I don't think people being 1.4 versus 1.3 weights is going to like reach that level, especially when we've been so far out of whack for the past however many years. I know, Linda, you had a hand as well.
No, I was just wondering if it's functional to have it within the item rather. I don't think it is, but to open up only the weighting, not the entire regional agreement, but is it possible to open just the weighting at the will of the school committee?
I mean, that's something I guess I could ask the ask council. I mean, my take is keep it simple. I think I like what you're saying, Linda. If there is some simple little clause we could add that says, you know, it could be open at the will of the school committee rather than setting a time or what have you. I just don't see future committees really going to the trouble of it.
Right, unless there's
Yeah.
something really fast and extreme that happens. I agree.
Yeah.
So if it's, that's why I'm saying I don't know how functional that really is to put that in, but to have a every 5 years it automatically, and as it is, if the school committee wants to reopen the regional agreement before those 5 years, that that seems simple and straightforward, and like it would take care of any issues.
I can ask about that. Like, Paul, do you have something?
Just one weird situation that popped up in my head when you guys were talking is, you know, if we are doing once every 5 years, what if the weirdness happens on that 5th year? So, you know, let's say there's a global pandemic and the census is off for whatever reason, and the weighting gets skewed one way or another in that process. I wonder if we want to provide some sort of averaging over the 5 years or something else.
I think we're using the town census rather than the U.S. census, which is probably much more stable in terms of accuracy and precision, whichever we want to talk about, because, you know, while I think in urban areas it may be challenging, I think our towns mostly know where everybody is, and because they pay taxes. So I don't think it's super not accurate because of really anything, even a pandemic year. Like, it's basically just it's not a start from zero census. It's okay, you lived at this house, who lives at this house now. So it probably is pretty constant. I sort of also suspect that, like, as much as people complain when new houses seem to come in, there is actually a limit to the number of new development, like, per year. Like, it doesn't go up that fast, right? I mean, it's been a steady increase in Holden and a steady increase in Rutland and a plateau in the other places, right? But it hasn't been. I don't think the ratios have changed super fast. That every 5 years, unless the committee sees otherwise, you know, some reason otherwise, would really change much.
You calmed my fears. That makes sense.
Yeah. So then what I'm hearing is ask council not to wait, but see if there's a wiggle sentence we can put in where we wouldn't have to reopen the whole regional agreement if something was crazy, or not, depending on, maybe we can take council's advice on whether he thinks that's he can come up with language that doesn't just open Pandora's box there. I could imagine more likely situations where it's like, you know, I just lost a vote and now I go with a fine-tooth comb to try and figure out if the weighting was exactly right, and then make motions at the next meeting to say, oh, this wasn't right, and we want to either. That almost seems more likely to me than people actually changing it. So I can ask for that language, Carl.
So just one thing, just for reference, like just while we were talking, I just went into the folder and looked up Quabbin. And so Quabbin, what they did every 10 years, they reallocate the number of seats per town based on the U.S. Census. And then every year they adjust their weighting. So just for comparison, in case, like, when the question gets asked, what do the other districts do? That's what Quabbin does next door. I just haven't had a chance to dig through the others, but
I thought one of them did and one of them didn't, in my memory of it. So I don't think either way is wrong.
Just jumping off of that, would it make sense to, as it stands now, I'm sorry, I've been looking between them. Now I get mixed up on the details of ours. So ours is only looking at the local census as it stands now, or is it at the US Census? It's at the local, right?
It's the town census.
Right. So would it make sense to consider that every 10 with the US Census for allocation of seat numbers, and then a smaller period for waiting? Or is that another, too granular?
I think we should keep it as simple as possible, but I'm happy to listen to other people. This may be just my Paul. What do you think?
I am a big fan of keeping it simple, where the numbers are not going to change all that much. Less work for everyone involved. It would be terrible if someone forgot and the weights were wrong. So yeah, doing it less often but well, I think makes a lot of sense.
Carl?
So I just do another peek. So Gateway does it every 5 years. They do seats every 10 years and then adjust the weighting every 5 years. So, I mean, I think probably for simplicity's sake, I mean, we could just say the number of seats and the weighting gets would be evaluated every 5 years. Kind of a little bit of a middle ground there.
I would kind of lean towards that too. It's simple. We reviewed the original agreement. They fix the weighting, or they do something completely different, and then the next election it changes. Seems fairly straightforward. I just don't think it's going to change much to like the I mean, I was also doing the weighting to 1 decimal place, right? Which we hadn't ever discussed that, but I assume that's what we were. We don't want to go too wackadoodle with this, right? So I don't think it going out to the 10th place is going to change very much from year to year. And I would imagine that 90% of our votes are just unanimous or the chair abstaining. I mean, that hasn't always been the case, but well,
on that front, I did talk to people on Quabbin administration. I talked to Sheila and our director of teaching and learning and the union president, just various folks, and everyone sort of said the same thing, that it very rarely matters. In cases when it does, then they do have a spreadsheet set off in the back where the executive administrative assistant punches in the numbers, and it works pretty well. That was a bit of homework I said I would do, and I did.
So I had sent an email to the board chairs, the school committee chairs of the towns we talked about, and I hadn't heard back yet, but they're busy. But thank you for that input. So in terms of process, I feel like I have some marching orders to give to district council. I'll have to probably talk him through this and give him some documents. My suggestion was going to be that we prepare 3 motions, one for the school committee to accept everything but the this bit, one for weighted voting, and one for the 26-member HAR, which is fine. I mean, I can see reasons for that. The other suggestion I was going to have to add to our report, but not to the motions, was recommending, of course, all we're doing is recommending to the next year's committee, the creation of like an ad hoc governance committee to deal with some of the questions that have come up. I think subcommittee structure, best practices for that, thinking about how meetings will run, onboarding, that kind of thing could be useful. Matt?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would even, I mean, we're talking town election where this would have to, any changes. So I would say right after the reorg that should be, I mean, we could almost vote a ad hoc subcommittee with a charge right now, right? And just say to be appointed. Because what it really has to do is look at our bylaws.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. And in the past, we've asked legal affairs to do that, and that just is a huge undertaking for legal affairs. They have enough business. So it's almost a charge to review the bylaws and the organizational needs based upon any changes to the subcommittee, to the full school committee size, I mean.
Yeah, I definitely agree that the bylaws have to be are a huge part of that. I think there's a smidging of some policy too, in terms of, you know, onboarding, new member orientation that we heard a lot at that meeting, and I've heard individually too, that it's kind of ancillarily related to like how the meetings run.
Right.
And you know, so that committee could also look at policy and look at best practices for how meetings are run. The way our agenda is in the bylaws, so of course how the meetings are run is part of the bylaws, but I think it's also a discussion the full committee will have to have next year in terms of, you know, like how do we want to do our business? You know, like what should the meetings actually look like?
Yeah.
How often should they be? You know,
an argument could be made that you could meet every week or every other week and get rid of subcommittees altogether, right? Or except the ones that you need. I mean, there's so many ways to do it. So yeah, I take back what I say about putting a charter in place right now and just say it'll be formed.
Yeah.
You talked me out of it, Ken.
Yeah, as you say, there's a variety of ways that could happen. I think you have to have a business and finance subcommittee. I think that's required somewhere. But one could keep all the subcommittees. One could get rid of all of them. But and somewhere in between probably is where you might want to fall. But that's, I think, for next year's committee to figure out. We got a lot of work to do this year with superintendent and budget and this. Paul?
Do we have to figure out how this rolls out? I know you had suggested letting people ride out their term and adjust the weighting accordingly. Is that the route we're taking?
I guess that's the other big question. So yeah, that is the hot button question, I guess, of how we propose to do that. Obviously, nothing we do now matters until the following election, because it won't be approved until winter anyway. But I don't know that I really heard from the full committee, much feeling about that. I don't think it was really discussed. What do people think?
I mean, I think, Paul, if it went, you can't really, right? If weighted failed and it went to the 26th, that kind of takes care of itself. If weighting passes, then the question is, okay, how do we determine when it gets down to whatever size that weighting is? And I think it's probably when terms run out and you just adjust the weighting every year until it gets to the appropriate size. I would think. I don't know. I mean, it's mathematics, right?
Yeah.
If you have 4 reps and their weighting is 1.5 each, when it goes down to 3, then the weighting's 2.0.
Paul, what do you have to say?
Yeah, just one weird thing. I don't think we got much comment at the big school committee, but I don't think it's sunk in. And I think there will be some weirdness that comes about. So if you're an Holden rep whose term ends in 2 years and it's going to go down substantially, maybe it's more advantageous for you to run after 1 year and get another 3-year term in or something like that. It might put weird people running, against one another for only a single seat or something like that.
Hey, Linda, what do you have?
So, would we be able to mark out the phases when we present it to the committee, so that, assuming, like, if weighted gets voted forward and is approved by the towns and the commissioner, and we start embarking on that for May of 2023 would be the
Right.
first potential. So if we do like an attrition model of seats, can we mark that out that it would be, in 2023 we expect Holden terms, X terms to end, and it'll bring us to this total. Can we just have a chart? That's my favorite suggestion, is to have a chart.
I guess I don't know, because the other question would be, what if, there were X number of Holden people and then member X resigned? Did they get replaced, or is that automatically go down, right?
I mean,
these are things that are very right. You just brought up a good point, Ken. We get a lot of resignation. So does the weighting adjust when someone resigns?
That's an interesting question. Even aside from the transition, right? Like there's the transition.
Aside from a transition, if a seat goes unfulfilled for 3 months, does weighting get adjusted in that meantime? My logic tells me it kind of should, right? If a town wants to be represented fairly, but I don't know how that plays out.
Yeah, I don't know.
I honestly think this is the type of thing that we refer to the attorney to look at how others have made these transition, and I think because we're going to end up sitting here all night thinking of these weird scenarios that do happen.
Yeah, and I think that to Paul's point too, like it's weird, I'll say, like, and I can see how different people could have different stakes. Like as somebody who's not planning to run again, I can say, well, it makes the most sense to just like fold all the seats and then restart it in 2023 and say, okay, Holden has like 3 3-year seats, 3 2-year seats, and 3 1-year seats, and then the other towns, whatever ratio, just to kind of like spread out the elections and start from scratch. But I can see if I had just got elected to that seat, saying, "Hey, wait a second, I just got elected to this thing, and I was elected to a 3-year term, and the voters put me into a 3-year term, and you're messing with the will of the voters to not let me serve for 3 years." So I agree a little bit with Matt that we should probably get district council's opinion. And it may be that precedent sets that yes, you always do it by attrition, or yes, you always do it by resetting. I don't know.
Or is there a way to do it where nobody feel, and I haven't thought through what it looks like down the road, but what if everybody lived out their term that they were elected to? Does that then, but if you say that it starts next year, does that give someone an advantage to be elected this year? I don't know. I don't think so.
Yeah.
It just means you run for your term, but that means your term might end and your seat might not be available to rerun for.
Yeah, and it might mess up like the setting of like, okay, a 3, 2, and 1-year term kind of deal, like wanting to make sure that it's like if Holden went from 10 to 6, it'd be nice if there was 2 seats a year rather than 3 seats 1 year and no seats the other year.
Exactly. I don't know I like Linda's idea of a chart and hearing from the attorney, but I think we need to map it out in maybe the math will show us in the chart.
Yeah, I like the chart. We'll definitely have to have a chart. Carl, what's your take?
I mean, I was just going to add just the other question would be, so say the committee agrees and goes to weighted voting, and then say the commissioner signs off on it, say December 1st. So December 1st, it's approved. Does that mean we should go to weighting our 22-member committee at that point? And so it's just like, so that we would have weighted voting and then the numbers would just drop down? Or would it be something that we would say all changes with committee size and weighting would come into effect in the next election? So, I mean, I think that's just the same puzzle we're talking about, just kind of getting clarification on these things from council.
I think for that one, I feel pretty strongly we should wait till May 23. But I think all of the other implications of it are related to that, right? In terms of, from Matt's point about, someone resigns, so the weights change until they appoint somebody new. Does that make a weird motivation for some boards to select people to actually not appoint a new member if, like, you could have all sorts of weird complications,
Yeah, that's the weird part about it, right? Somebody resigns and the board doesn't agree with them, so they don't appoint somebody and just have a higher weight for the one voice, right? That kind of seems weird.
Yeah, it takes some of the urgency of the BOS reappointing. away, which is sort of unfortunate. We're definitely going down some some rabbit holes, which I think are all legitimate. But it's interesting. Paul, you have your hand?
Yeah, I was just going to initially respond to Carl's suggestion about waiting till the next May. I felt strongly about that. But then also to Matt's point about, I think if someone resigns, then I also feel like the weights should not be adjusted for that time for the sake of urgency. And also, we got into this thinking it would be as simple as we would make it as simple as possible. And I feel like it's a lot simpler to keep it there. It's almost like the person, they were elected to a seat. They're not showing up. They're not doing their part or whatever, for whatever reason. And so it's up to the town to get someone else in that seat back so that they're at full capacity. So I don't think we necessarily have to feel pressured to adjust the weights in all these different situations.
And I think another question I have for council is on the budget vote, and if there's anything particular that we need to be aware of when we talk about 15 votes, if we're, just because that percentage is in MGL, if it's somehow different, I don't know how it would be, but it just makes me a little anxious. So I'd want to make sure that it would have to be in the language, just maybe in the document. Paul?
Well, that's it needs 2/3. That's why it's 15, right?
Right.
2/3 of the standing committee. So I think it would probably be 2/3 of the overall weight.
I would agree. I would definitely think that's what it should be. I just want to make sure there's not some weird language thing that makes it. I mean, it works in Quabbin, so it must be pretty straightforward. But it just gives me some pang of angst I'd want to check. But I agree, it should probably just be the weights. We don't want to have pangs of angst for too long. I think somebody had a hand. I'm sorry. They put their hand down. Paul?
Well, it was just a request for clarification because I didn't know what you were talking about. But I think I gleaned that we need 2/3 vote in order to pass a budget.
We do, yeah. Linda?
So I thought that the weighted voting that we discussed was 16 members, not 15.
I think it's 16. Did I say 15?
Yeah.
I think it's
So I was
16,
just double checking. Okay.
Yeah. Another question I guess I have is, again, if we're going to go down the rabbit hole, we might as well. I don't think it has to be in the agreement. I think we just have to have some of these things written down. Is quora and voting on subcommittees? If assuming there are still subcommittees, how does my weight affect my vote at a subcommittee? I kind of think it doesn't need to. I think it could just be straight up people at the subcommittee because it's the full committee that actually votes on things. I just don't want to leave that to some argument downstream, about something. Even for open meeting law, it's like, does it affect OML of how many people can have a deliberation if they're weightier people than others? And it's again rabbit hole stuff, but stuff I think that's worth having written down somewhere, even if it's not in the agreement itself. You can imagine a subcommittee having a core of the full committee, but not realizing it because of the weighting. So in terms of,
and that could be something that again that ad hoc committee looks at, right? Like if you had weighting and a weight associated with everyone, you know what the total weight is and what the 50% weight is, right? But then again, if somebody resigns, that changes the total, right? So I think those are things that math helps us, but you have to think of every scenario. And I tend to think if you can just do a subcommittee of take weighting out, that's probably the easiest way to manage a subcommittee, right? Because the subcommittee is not passing policy without going to a full committee anyway. And so Paul, point Paul made is simple. Simple is better, and it seems like the more you think about it, the more we can make it as complicated as possible.
Yeah, we're good about that. Linda?
So my thinking just there is, So if we have our subcommittees, and even if in the matters we have one member has one vote instead of they're weighted, but if a subcommittee is formed without checking the full committee, the weights of those members as full committee members, right? That's where we could enter into problems of having a full
Yep.
have quorum for full deliberation.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, we need a cheat card of all the different. It's like going to the blackjack table. You need a card of every possible scenario telling you what to do.
Well,
And
even
it should have charts on the sheet chart.
my gosh, charts, so many charts. So the what I'm curious about with like say Quabbin, that spreadsheet that they have to fill out for the votes, I mean, that's public information, right? So I'm just imagining, folks at home with their spreadsheets marking down the votes, but we can use that for like the chair signing subcommittees and that kind of thing as well. And we would have that as part of our, onboarding of membership of who has what votes, not just what town they're from. So, I mean, it would just be a matter of a lot of details, but charts take care of a lot of that.
And at the end of the day, aside from our fair colleagues from Princeton, the weights aren't that different anyway. So it probably won't matter too much, I suspect.
Well, that's what I was going to point out. It looked like on the 16 member size, the weights were very close. That it shouldn't, knock on wood, right? It really shouldn't make that much difference. It looked like they were within like a 10 or 20 percentile range.
If we had a whole bunch of people, if we built that high rise in Princeton, we could sort of fix this problem. Well,
are you, so just so that I understand the process, we come to an agreement, or after you get legal counsel, and then that goes to full committee, and then they vote on it, and then is it done, or does this get voted on by the town in May?
so it's a couple other steps. So we vote on it, and then Desi actually has to pre-approve it before it goes somewhere. And then the towns vote on it in May. I'm sure the boards of selectmen will offer an opinion on that. And then it has to go back to Desi, and the commissioner has to approve the change, which may take him a day, or it may take him 6 months or 7 months, like it did last time. This wasn't the same commissioner, so I'm not saying he would do that, but it took our former commissioner 7 months to approve it.
Because I'm thinking that the committee is going to care a little bit about the weightings, but I think they're close enough to what we had before, where it'll pass scrutiny pretty quickly. But the change in numbers is something we haven't talked all that much about, but it's probably going to garner the majority of the attention of the townspeople, definitely. And I don't know if there's anything you can do about that, but it's probably worth discussing.
So I'm looking out at the calendar and seeing that we have a meeting on the 15th and a meeting on the 28th. And we have one next week too, but that's not happening for this. So what do we think about, like, I don't know how fast or slow Joe's going to be. I mean, I don't mean that in any sort of bad way, but it's kind of complicated, right? We're asking him to write language. We obviously need to meet again to look at what he does before we send it to the full committee, and we have to give it to the committee not the day before. I think people would want to see it, right, before they vote on it. I think another question I have for council is really like, how much of that do we have to decide today? Like all these things we've talked about, like, how much of it has to be in the agreement versus how much of it can be figured out after we vote for it. But what do we think in terms of timing? Like what meeting? I don't think we can go past the 28th meeting.
Is it the 15th or the 28th?
15th to the 28th, I think, yeah.
My suggestion would be the 15th, and we as a subcommittee meet before that, because the 28th is the first Monday after February break.
Linda, what do you have?
The same thing. Yeah, I think let's get it done, get it hopefully ready to go on the 15th so that we can, if there is any referring back or anything like that, there's time. but hopefully it'll just be.
So I'm looking at my calendar, and it looks like that would probably mean we'd have to meet on either the 9th or the 10th as a subcommittee, right? Because we'd have to like look over it, think we feel okay about it, and then get it to the people before the 15th meeting, which is a Tuesday.
I can't do the 9th, just so you know.
Okay. How about the 10th for people? The fact that it's a Tuesday rather than a Monday might give us some wiggle about getting it to the committee.
I'm okay on the 10th.
Assume we'll do it virtually, makes it easier for people. And as many people are watching this now as they would be watching this if we were live, because it's on TV. So 10th, should we say, can we say 6:30? It gives me a little bit more wiggle to get home from work, or do we want to do 6?
I can't. 6:30 is rough for me. 7
Okay.
is a lot better, but I can, as
7,
long as you don't mind waiting for me.
7 is fine for me too. Do we want to say 7? So the February 10th at 7?
That works.
All right. So I will ask Randy to put that on the calendar. Hopefully we can. I'll send some. If I get something, obviously, if I get something back from the council, I'll send it along for you all to review ahead of time. So we can't discuss it, but you can at least get it in your hands before the meeting. Assuming I get it back from him, I'll try and reach out to him tomorrow and set up a time to talk. So we'll see where we go from there. All right. So does anybody have anything else before we take a motion to adjourn? Paul.
One really quick thing: if the council can't get it in time, it might be to our advantage to meet anyway, and just outline it as clearly as we can, and let the full committee know what we're doing. We're having the council develop the final language, but this is what the proposal is meant to entail.
It might also make sense to ask him to come to this meeting if he can, so that if we have questions as we're going through it, that he can answer them rather than having to go back and talk to him again. He might not be able to answer it right away if he hasn't got his head around it, but
As long as we're early on the agenda, since we're not paying the bill for him to sit and wait.
oh, I meant for the subcommittee meeting, but yeah, he could come to the full meeting too. I agree that I would want to ask Mike to put that under an early agenda item, because you're right, we don't want to pay $200 for him to spectate at our meeting, or more than that, I'm sure. But all right, so if there's nothing else, I will consider a motion to adjourn. Thanks, Linda, for the minutes.
So moved.
So moved. Is there a second?
Second.
Paul?
Dubois, yes.
Carl?
Otmar, yes.
Linda?
Woodland, yes.
Matt?
Lavoie, yes. Thank you for taking the minutes.
And Mills, yes. So we're good to go. So I will see you all in 14 minutes. Okay, bye.